The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Manfromleng. Thank you very much for joining me today. This is a very special Christmas episode of The Whisper in Darkness because it is part of All Purple All the Time, a challenge of sorts that was issued by the Arkham Chronicle YouTube channel. Earlier this month, I was approached by Ed from over at the Arkham Chronicle to participate in a collaboration involving 4 podcasts: the Arkham Chronicle, Mythosbusters, Drawn to the Flame, and myself, The Whisper in Darkness. Now, Ed pitched the idea that each podcast would design a deck using one of the 4 Mystic Investigators available in the game. Each deck would be built on the assumption that it would be played in a 4-player game with the other 3 Mystics. However, each deck would be built in secret, which would force each of us to speculate and anticipate what the others would bring to the table. The Arkham Chronicle has built a deck for Marie Lambeau, who was the promo released last year, while Mythosbusters and Drawn to the Flame have built decks for Agnes Baker and Akachi Onyele, respectively. As you can tell from the title of this episode, I've built a deck for none other than Jim Culver, everyone's favorite jazz musician. All 4 podcasts are unveiling their decks today, so make sure you check out the other 3 podcasts and see their creations and weigh in on how we did. I'm certainly looking forward to those podcasts. Always put out some great content. I'll make sure I leave a link to each of those podcasts in the show notes so you can find them. So why Jim Culver? Well, I've got a bit of a soft spot for this jazz musician because he reminds me a lot of a character from Dead Man's Stomp, one of the introductory scenarios from the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game back in the very early 1990s. Now, Call of Cthulhu was my introduction to H.P. Lovecraft and the Cthulhu mythos, and that scenario happens to feature a jazz musician by the name of Leroy Turner. Now, Turner is a jazz man with a broken heart, a drinking problem, and a curse in the form of an unusual trumpet. Turner believes the trumpet was a gift from none other than Louis Armstrong, but it was actually given to him by Nyarlathotep. When played by a gifted musician, this 4-valve trumpet raises the dead within hearing and drives the resurrected to vengeance. Now, Jim's lore mentions that jazz has been nothing but trouble for him since the day he picked up his daddy's trumpet, and dead folks get downright rambunctious when he plays his horn, so it's not much of a stretch to imagine that Jim is a descendant of Turner's, and that his trumpet is none other than Nyarlathotep's original gift. When the Dunwich Legacy expansion was released, Jim was the first investigator that I played. In fact, that game, which was a 2-hander featuring Skids O'Toole, was recorded for the very first episode of The Whisper in Darkness, the quote-unquote lost episode that has been never released, and probably for the best. It was very long. Needless to say, I'm looking forward to revisiting Jim to see how his deck has evolved since then, and give this musician a little bit of the applause that I think he deserves. This episode is going to be similar to the Deck Tech episodes that I did for each of the investigators from the Path to Carcosa Deluxe expansion. I'm going to take a look at Jim's stats, his special ability, and his signature cards before I delve into the nitty-gritty of building a deck around him for a game involving 3 other mystics. If you like what you hear, make sure you check out my other videos and maybe consider subscribing to the channel. So with that in mind, let's see whether this jazz musician hits the right notes. Now, if you ask a player on any of the forums to rank the Mystic Investigators, there's a pretty good chance that Jim Culver will be at the bottom of the list. Honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised to see him toward the bottom of the list, ranking all of the investigators in the game. While there are a few players out there who are ardent fans of Jim's music and all that jazz, I think he's an acquired taste for others who really see him as a support player at best and never the star of the show. I think there are several reasons why Jim gets a bad rap. His stats, special abilities, signature cards, and the card pool available to him at the beginning of the game all play into the perception that he's underpowered compared to other investigators in general, and the other mystics in particular. So I'd like to try to change that perception a little bit by going over his stats and special ability. Jim has 4 willpower, 3 intellect, 3 combat, and 2 agility. He has the performer trait, 7 health, and 8 sanity. His special ability treats the modifier on skull tokens you reveal from the Chaos Bag as 0. Anytime you reveal an Elder Sign token, you may choose instead to treat it as a skull token. His Elder Sign ability is +1. Now, Jim's stats are solid, but they don't really blow you away at first blush like those on Investigators who bring that coveted 5 skill to the table. More often than not, it feels a lot like what Jim can do. Another Mystic can probably do better. Jim's willpower skill value of 4 is good, but it does lag behind that of Agnes and Akachi. Mystics live and die by their spells, most of which hinge on passing willpower skill tests. The fact that Jim appears to be weaker than either Agnes or Akachi before you pull from the Chaos Bag is really a big knock against him in many players' eyes. Now, Jim does have a higher intellect skill value than either Agnes or Akachi. However, Mystics rarely use their intellect to gather clues. Most players prefer to use Drawn to the Flame or to avoid making intellect skill tests altogether, or they play cards like Rite of Seeking to test willpower instead. Now, Jim does have a big advantage over Agnes and Akachi because he can use cards in the Seeker class, such as Dr. Mylan Christopher and Magnifying Glass, to boost his intellect. This certainly helps him in situations that force you to investigate the hard way, such as the Where Doom Awaits scenario that we saw in the Dunwich Legacy. Cards like Drawn to the Flame and Rite of Seeking don't really help you in that scenario at all. Dr. Mylan Christopher and the Magnifying Glass can also help him with investigate actions on cards such as the Man in the Pallid Mask, who we see play a predominant role in the Path to Carcosa campaign. Again, Rite of Seeking really doesn't help you if you need to take that and make that investigate action on the Man in the Pallid Mask. It's important to note, however, that Marie can also use up to 5 level 0 Seeker cards, and she's got a base intellect of 4, so Jim's not the only Mystic who can step into that Seeker role if need be. Jim also has the advantage over the other Mystics when it comes to his combat skill value of 3. Akachi also has a combat skill value of 3, but she can't leverage it quite the same way as Jim because he can use powerful weapons such as the Machete from the Guardian class and Fire Axe from the Survivor class to boost his combat skill as well as his damage. The other advantage of these weapons, of course, is that they don't run out of charges like Shriveling, nor are they one-shot tools like Storm of Spirits, which was just released in the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack. If you combine these weapons with Jim's very respectable 7 health and 8 sanity, you've got the makings of a pretty formidable tank. I've used Jim in that capacity in the past in playing multiplayer, and I've always been impressed by his ability to step up and take a beating for a couple of turns while the other investigators figure out how to neutralize the threat in front of them. If Jim has an obvious weakness, it is his agility skill value of 2, which is lower than the other Mystics, who all have 3, I believe. 2 agility really isn't going to do him any favors if he needs to evade an enemy or pass an agility skill test, so he's going to need help from cards like Blinding Light and Manual Dexterity in those situations. The second issue with players have with Jim is his special ability, which is all about playing around with the odds of the Chaos Bag. If you take a look at the contents of the Chaos Bag at the start of the Path to Carcosa campaign, for example, there are 3 skull tokens in the bag, regardless of the difficulty level. On easy difficulty, Jim has a 60% chance of pulling at least a 0 for the bag, 0 from the bag, while the other Mystics top out at 40%. Jim maintains his advantage as the difficulty level increases. On standard difficulty, Jim has a 46.7% chance of pulling at least a 0 modifier compared to 26.7% for the other Mystics. On hard and expert, Jim's chances dip to 43.75% and 29.5% respectively. The best the other Mystics can do are 25% and 11.8% respectively. So Jim really has a great advantage over the other mystics when it comes to pulling from the Chaos Bag if you're even before the skill test. And if you look at it that way, suddenly Jim's ho-hum stats don't really look nearly so bad, since he does have that much better chance of passing skill tests than his fellow investigators. Now, if you throw a few of Jim's favorite toys into the mix, you're going to find yourself hard-pressed to fail a skill test toward the end of a campaign. Jim's ability also means he should be able to generate a slight card and resource advantage over the course of a campaign, since he won't need to pitch as many cards and resources as other investigators to pass certain skill tests. Now, generating some type of advantage, whether it's cards, resources, or actions, it's a huge part of this game, and Jim is well positioned to do just that if you have a bit of an understanding of probabilities and the tokens in the Chaos Bag. Now, personally, I think Jim's ability is extremely powerful, but it's also very subtle, and I'd argue it's almost too subtle. Most other investigators have special abilities that are really easy to quantify. Agnes, for example, she damages enemies. Marie generates action advantage. Akachi, she can generate extra charges on her spells. I think it's a lot harder for someone who's playing Jim to see that they're doing roughly 20% better on certain skill tests, especially if you're playing on easy or standard difficulty when the difference between success and failure is much less pronounced than on hard or expert. And let's be honest, the vast majority of people who play this game play on easy and standard difficulty. There's nothing wrong with that. It just simply means that Jim's ability doesn't really get a chance to shine as brightly as some of the others in the game, and players are more likely to gravitate to one of the more flashy investigators and take a pass on Jim, because it's just so hard to tell when he is actually helping you in the game. The third issue with Jim is his signature card. Jim's Trumpet, the Dead Listen, is a 2-cost asset with 2 willpower and 1 wild skill icon. It has the item, instrument, and relic traits, and it takes up a hand slot. It has the response trigger when a skull token is revealed during a skill test. Exhaust Jim's Trumpet. Heal 1 horror from an investigator at your location or a connecting location. Now, many players consider Jim's Trumpet to be among the weaker signature cards in the game. Others believe Jim is a much better investigator with the Trumpet in play than without it. I tend to agree with the latter perspective. The biggest problem with the Trumpet is that its ability to heal horror depends almost entirely on the number of players in the game, as well as the contents of the Chaos Bag. If there are 4 investigators playing the Path to Carcosa campaign, for example, there's a far greater chance of triggering the Trumpet, since those 4 investigators are naturally going to be making a lot more skill tests, and there are 3 skulls in the bag. If you're playing the Dunwich Legacy solo, though, you're going to have a much different perspective on the Trumpet, since you won't trigger its response nearly as often. More often than not, you're probably not going to give it a second thought as you pitch it to a skill test for its potentially 3 willpower icons. That is, of course, if you're able to find it in your deck in time. As with most of the signature cards, the Trumpet is a singleton, which means you're not gonna see it in every game unless you make a concerted effort to dig for it. Now, Jim is in a better position than some of the other mystics in that regard, because he can include Seeker cards such as Preposterous Sketches and No Stone Unturned to help him find his Trumpet. However, I'm not entirely convinced that the Trumpet is powerful enough, at least in solo play, to warrant including those cards in your deck just to hunt for it. On the plus side, Jim's signature weakness, Final Rhapsody, I think it's one of the more benign weaknesses in the game, because it doesn't tax Jim's actions, first of all, and there's even a small chance it will whiff entirely, and Jim will take no damage or horror. If you're playing the Path to Carcosa campaign, for example, there's only a 0.4% chance of pulling all 3 skull tokens and the tentacle from the Chaos Bag, and therefore taking 4 damage and 4 horror. Most of the time you're going to pull only 1 or 2 of those tokens, and given Jim's respectable health and sanity, Final Rhapsody shouldn't hurt him too badly, and potentially it won't hurt him at all. The final issue that I have with Jim is the card pool available to him at the beginning of a campaign. Now, most of the Mystic cards that synergize with Jim's special abilities, such as Grotesque Statue, the Jewel of Aureolus, Gift of the Homunculi, I finally think I might have pronounced that correctly, and Song of the Dead cost experience. Now, there aren't many level 0 Mystic cards that you can point to and say with confidence, that, my friend there, that is a Jim card. And that means there's a tendency for level 0 Jim decks to look a lot like a poor man's Agnes deck. And that really begs the question, why don't you just play Agnes instead? So I'm hoping the designers recognize that, and hopefully Jim's options among the level 0 Mystic cards will improve as the campaign expands, as the card pool expands. So he feels a little bit more distinct from his Mystic counterparts, particularly at level 0. Now, if there's one thing that sets Jim apart from the other Mystics, it is his deck building options to include up to 5 level 0 cards from any other class. Choosing those 5 cards is one of the most difficult decisions you'll make while building a Jim deck, because there are just so many different strategies to explore. Jim is an extremely versatile investigator. In one campaign he might be gathering clues, and then in another he could be just laying waste to enemies. Fortunately, Jim has been out for almost a year now, and players have had a chance to play around with him, and they've coalesced around a few builds have coalesced around a few key cards. One of the most notable builds is F-Bone's Invincible Jim deck, which uses Dr. Myling Christopher and scavenging to generate resources and recycle key items, such as the Grotesque Statue and Jim's Trumpet, should he need to discard it to a skill test. Now, there's another version of this deck that uses Leo DeLuca, but it basically wants to achieve the same goals as using that Grotesque Statue as many times as possible to really rig the Chaos Bag in your favor. Another notable deck is Rathburn's Skill Test What Skill Tests deck, which emphasizes clue gathering with cards like Flashlight, Rite of Seeking, Drawn to the Flame, and the Survivor event, Look What I Found. The deck also uses 2 copies of Lucky to pass those skill tests that really you should have no business making. Now, both F-Bone's and Rathburn's decks prioritize clue gathering over combat, so they're probably best paired with an investigator who can provide some muscle, like a Roland Banks or a Zoe Samras. I've had a chance to actually play Rathburn's deck, and it turned out to work out quite well. It's quite a good deck if you need to gather clues. Other decks such as King Mob's Epic Sax Guy or Start with the Names Jim the Axeman Culver deck take a more offensive approach, doubling up on cards like Machete or Fire Axe for some offensive punch. Guard Dog, which is also in Rathburn's deck, is another interesting option to protect Jim and chip in with some direct damage. The Guard Dog can come in very handy if you need Jim to tank an enemy for a turn or two, because Jim has a pretty good chance of taking it down between the Guard Dog, the damage the Guard Dog does, and the damage that Jim can put out. Finally, a few players like Kissom77 have been experimenting with using Jim as more like in a healer role, and they're using cards such as First Aid, Medical Text, Liquid Courage, and or Clarity of Mind to complement the ability of Jim's Trumpet to heal damage and horror on other investigators. As you can see from the previous examples, there are quite a few ways to build a Jim Culver deck. The big question for me is which of those strategies is the most viable in a party of 4 Mystics. And before I started building a deck for All Purple all the time, I asked myself a few questions. They're questions I ask myself typically when I do sit down to build a deck. And the first is what type of deck do I want to play? Now, this may seem like an obvious question, but I don't mean just at the start of a campaign. I find it easier to build a deck when you have an idea of what you want the deck to look like once you've gained a few experience points. For example, if you're interested in building a deck similar to F-Bone's Invincible Jim deck, that means you need to put scavenging in the deck at the beginning of the campaign, or you're going to need to plan to make room for it later. And in order to scavenge successfully, you need to successfully investigate by 2 or more, which means you're going to need to include ways to either boost Jim's intellect or make it easier to pass investigate actions. Now, scavenging counts against the limit of 5 level 0 cards from any other class, so that's certainly something you need to take into consideration. And if you want to boost Jim's intellect, you're probably going to have to look out of class for those cards as well. And that, between those two, that doesn't really leave you a lot of room to explore other ideas in a Jim deck. 5 out-of-class cards is not very many, and you often have way more choices that you want to include than deck slots. The other question I ask myself is what role will Jim play in a party of 4 mystics? Now, gathering clues is going to be critical to any party's success, and 4 mystics are going to be leaning heavily on cards like Flashlight, Rite of Seeking, Drawn to the Flame, and Perception to help them out in that regard. Jim can certainly help in situations that demand intellect tests, although it's important to note that Marie can also fill that role if necessary. 4 mystics are going to be packing 8 copies of Shriveling between them to handle combat, and they can even back up that threat now with Storm of Spirits from the Unspeakable Oath Mythos pack. If Shriveling charges run into short supply, Jim could help out with either a machete or the Fire Axe. Some Agnes decks also play Fire Axe, so I think the Mystics have combat covered between Shriveling and Storm of Spirits. The group's evasion options are going to be fairly limited. Of course, there is the Mystic Event Blinding Light, and Agnes and Marie can look to the Survivor class for some answers if they need to evade an enemy. Evasion is really not Jim's forte, so he's not going to be able to help out the group very much in that respect. Other ideas I had included, you could follow Kissum 77's example and play Jim as a healer to heal damage and horror. Certainly an investigator like Agnes would really appreciate you if you could heal some of that horror off her so she can really leverage her special ability. One of the other ideas I had was using Jim to feed resources to other investigators using teamwork from the Guardian class. Mystic decks tend to be quite resource intensive, so if you were able to build the Jim deck to be cheap enough, you might be able to pass all those extra resources on to other players who could use them to pay for their more expensive spells. And that's one angle that I was quite interested in exploring. The third question I asked myself is, was there anything unique that Jim can bring to the group? And if you look at the investigators, Agnes, she can use level 0 to 2 survivor cards. Marie can also use survivor cards as well as seeker cards. Of course, Akachi can only really use mystic cards. She definitely has the most restrictive deck building of all the mystics. Jim is the only investigator in the group who can use Guardian and Rogue cards, so perhaps there's something in those 2 classes worth considering. Of course, there's always great allies like Leo DeLuca from the Rogue class and the aforementioned Guard Dog that we've seen used in some of the other Jim builds. So when I sat down to build my Jim deck, of course you need a place to start, and I thought there was no better place to start than with the ally slot, since I think it's one of the most interesting decisions that you need to make when you're teaming up with 3 other mystics. There are only 3 allies in the Mystic class: the Arcane Initiate from the core set, Alyssa Graham, Speaker of the Dead from Undimensioned and Unseen, and David Renfield, esteemed eschatologist from Echoes of the Past. Now, there's no way all 4 mystics can show up to the game packing Arcane Initiates. Well, I guess they could, but you're going to rocket through the agenda deck because you're going to be adding all that extra doom to play unless you find a way to kill them off. So I decided to make a few assumptions about who would bring who to the party, and I thought that would help me narrow down my list, particularly of the out-of-class cards I wanted to include in my deck. Now, Agnes has the option of picking up cards from the Survivor class, so I assumed that she would go for Peter Sylvester from the Dunwich Legacy expansion. I know Mythosbusters has built a few different Agnes decks over the time, but the Peter Sylvester Painkiller combo is really amazing in Agnes, and I think it makes a lot of sense to go with that here, if only to avoid potential conflicts with other players. It's also an easy way for Agnes to keep the amount of horror on her down, so she can keep using her special ability as much as possible. The investigator I feel the most sorry for is poor Akachi. Her deck building restrictions really only leave her with 3 in-class options, and Marie covets at least 2 of those. Spells are Akachi's bread and butter, so if anybody is going to be playing Arcane Initiate, it should probably be her, and so I assume that Drawn to the Flame would gravitate towards packing the Arcane Initiates in their decks. Now, I've never had a chance to play Marie Lambeau because she was a promo investigator, so it's a lot more difficult for me to anticipate which way the Arkham Chronicle will go with her. Marie's special ability is active only when she has one or more Doom among the cards she controls, and if she wants Doom fast, Arcane Initiate, Alyssa Graham, and David Renfield are all viable options. Now, I think in this circumstance, Alyssa Graham is probably the best option to go with, since she provides an extra intellect icon, which will boost Marie's intellect to 5. And her ability is also a free trigger, and that gives Marie a lot more control over when she places the Doom in play and can activate her ability. She also has the option of placing another Doom on Alyssa if she happens to get wiped when the agenda advances and all Doom is removed from play. And that's something Marie can't do with a card like the Arcane Initiate. However, Marie also has the option of taking one of the best allies in the game in Dr. Mylan Christopher. The good doctor is going to boost Marie's intellect to 5 and is capable of generating a pile of extra resources that she could spend on her spells, and that makes him a very tempting card to include in a Marie deck. If I was playing Marie with 3 other Mystics, I'd probably go for Alyssa Graham and or David Renfield. However, there's no guarantee Arkham Chronicle is going to do the same, so I sort of feel like Marie is the real wild card in this challenge. All of the Mystic allies are accounted for, which I think means Jim really needs to look out of class. Fortunately, he does have a couple of excellent options. Dr. Mylan Christopher and Leo DeLuca, both of whom are from the core set, are both amazing allies, and it's really hard to choose between the 2 of them. Dr. Mylan Christopher is going to boost Jim's intellect and resource generation, while Leo DeLuca, he just offers such great action advantage that's going to just straight up win you games. If you get him out early enough and you're able to take 4 actions a turn, that's simply amazing. Now, it was a very difficult decision which one of these guys to go with, but ultimately I decided to go with Dr. Mylan Christopher. Leo DeLuca's extra actions are awesome, but intellect icons are the king, particularly if the group is going to be playing the Path to Carcosa campaign, which I sort of assumed we would be. And the more intellect icons you can that you can stuff into your deck before you take on the Path to Carcosa, I really think the better. Now, I might run into a conflict with Marie Lambeau, but I think Alyssa is a better option in that deck since she synergizes with Marie's special ability, and you can turn it on right away. Whereas if Marie took Dr. Mylan Christopher, she'd have to wait until she drew an Elder Sign in order to put a Doom in play, and that might not work out too well. It's just so much easier to trigger Alyssa in that respect. I also like the idea of including Dr. Mylan Christopher in the deck because it does allow me to explore the idea of feeding extra resources to other investigators using a card like Teamwork from the Guardian class. And it also gives me the option of pursuing F-Bone's Grotesque statue scavenging strategy at some point down the road if that sort of strategy interests me. Certainly, Grotesque statue is almost an auto-include in Jim by now. Scavenging, I'm a little less sold on. I've I've included it in a few decks, and I don't know whether it's my play style or the deck or just the situations I ran into, but I've never been able to get it to work properly. And so I'm not entirely certain I'm going to go I would go the scavenging route, which is one of the reasons I decided not to include that card in the deck right away. Although I would like to have the option at a later date, perhaps after I had a chance to test the deck a little bit more. Once I settled on Dr. Mylan Christopher as my ally, the rest of the deck came together fairly quickly, although I did spend quite a few nights trying to think of various cards to include, which cards to include, and which cards not to include. The general idea here is to play Jim Culver as a sort of mystical busker who's going to play his trumpet on the street corners to gain those extra resources, which he can use to fuel the investigation of the Mystic's investigation. Obviously, Dr. Mylan Christopher and Magnifying Glass boost Jim's intellect, which improve the odds of him gathering clues with flashlight and perception, as well as generating those extra resources. Forbidden Knowledge, Emergency Cash, and Uncage the Soul help Jim earn even more resources, which he can give to other investigators who need them using teamwork. It's also important to note that Jim can even use teamwork to give away Flashlight, Holy Rosary, Fine Clothes, or even Dr. Mylan Christopher if necessary toward the end of a scenario to provide that intellect boost to somebody else. You could even give them the Magnifying Glass if need be. So that's 2 intellect you could basically pass to another investigator who could use it. So I think that would come in very handy. Now, it was difficult to decide whether I should include 2 copies of Forbidden Knowledge or 1. I did want to see Forbidden Knowledge so I can generate those extra resources. However, I also like the idea of having Arcane Studies in my deck, especially for the late game, if you need to pass a difficult intellect skill test. Resources tend to build up on your card on your investigator towards the end of scenarios, and having a card where you can spend those, I've always found is very, very helpful. I debated whether to include a machete in this deck, but I think the party should be fine between Shriveling and Storm of Spirits. Obviously, Jim is going to want to use Uncage the Soul whenever possible to play those 2 cards for free. He can also use Uncage the Soul to drop Rite of Shriveling down at a sizable discount. I assumed the other decks were going to include 2 copies of Delve Too Deep in their decks. That's pretty safe assumption considering Mythosbusters is involved. They love that card over there. So I decided to leave it out of this deck and concentrate more on playing to Jim's strengths of generating those resources and boosting his intellect. So that's the deck overall. Most of the other cards are fairly self-explanatory. I mean, you've got Holy Rosary in there to boost Jim's willpower. If we're playing the Path to Carcosa campaign, a copy of Fine Clothes, at least in the first 2 scenarios, is never going to go to waste. I mean, it's one of those cards you can swap out probably after the Last King, but having that ability to help your parlay tests in that one is huge. I've already talked a little bit about Arcane Studies and Forbidden Knowledge. Ward of Protection is really a no-brainer. You might be able to play around a little bit with the skills. I've got 2 Guts, 1 Manual Dexterity, 2 Perception, and 2 Unexpected Courage. I included the Manual Dexterity largely because Curtain Call really does require some agility tests toward the end of that scenario, so having a copy of Manual Dexterity to pass 1 or 2 of those might not be a bad idea. Overall, I think the deck's got some solid investigation and solid combat, and it should be able to generate a fair number of extra resources over the course of a scenario, which it can then offload to another investigator who needs them to pay for their own spells. Leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions on ways to improve this deck. I'm looking forward to seeing what the other podcasts come up with for their decks to see if I made the right choices as far as allies go. Who knows, if I've got the time, I might even try a playthrough with all 4 investigators to see how they did. I don't think I've played 4-player on the channel since my very first episode, the playthrough of the Miskatonic Museum. It does take a little bit longer, which is why I tend to avoid playing with 4 players, but in this case it might be a very interesting experiment to see how Agnes, Marie, Akachi, and Jim fare with the decks that we built. So that's going to do it for my look at Jim Culver, the musician. Once again, I'd really like to thank Ed from over at the Arkham Chronicle for inviting me to participate in All Purple All the Time. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot about Jim while putting this episode together, and I hope you will too once you get a chance to listen to it. Jim's a fascinating investigator who's, I think he's a little underrated by the community, and if you get a chance, make sure you give him a try. Take him out for a spin, see how he plays. You know, he may not... He may work wonders for you, or he may disagree, and he may turn out to be trash. You never know. So much of this game depends on your experience, but I think Jim's ability can pull some games out of the fire for you. And do make sure you check out the Arkham Chronicle, Mythosbusters, and Drawn to the Flame later today. All 3 of those podcasts produce some really great content for this community. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with for All Purple All the Time. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps out the channel a great deal. Leave a comment down below on how we did and what you think of the deck that I built, and any suggestions you have for changing it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of when I release future content. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating. And Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.